This presentation on the Foreign Supplier Verification Program was prepared by the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance and meant to be an addendum or an addition to the preventive controls for animal food and human food courses that are delivered by lead instructors. I have modified this presentation in order to specifically show the applicability of this rule to a livestock animal feed mill, and I have recorded the presentation so you can watch it at your leisure. So this module is designed to explain the purpose and the implementation of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. The target audience, as this presentation is defined, is for foreign suppliers that actually manufacture, process, pack, or hold animal food intended for consumption in the U.S. But I think that the module as it is written thoroughly explains the rule as it applies to the importer here in the U.S. The rule requirements are directed at the importers, not the foreign suppliers. So you as an importer of animal food from outside the U.S. need to comply with this rule. So we're going to talk about this rule and explain what the requirements are. We're going to go through some definitions of terms and roles as they apply to this rule and describe what foods are subject to the rule or exempt from the rule and what the requirements are, both standard and modified, and discuss the importance of communication between importers, foreign suppliers, and other parties in the supply chain in order to meet the intent of this rule. So the purpose of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program rule is to ensure that food consumed in the United States is produced at the same level of public health protection as if it were produced in the U.S. And while the FDA does not have necessarily legal jurisdiction over foreign manufacturers, they do have the ability to restrict the importation of products made overseas if they feel they are not made under safe conditions. I have, for the purposes of this presentation, highlighted in red and crossed out sections of the rule that specifically apply to human food and not animal food, and I will not be addressing those. So this is the first slide that presents that type of information. So some definitions of food articles used for food or drink for man or other animals are included under this rule, and adulteration of food has the same definition as the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So it's the same definition as the Food Safety Modernization Act. A foreign supplier, if you remember in the PCQI training, we talked about the definition of a supplier as being the manufacturer, processor. It's the same for a foreign supplier. It is not who you purchase the food from. That could be a different party. That's the vendor that you would purchase the product from. But the food establishment that manufactures, processes the food, raises the animal, or grows the food that is exported to the United States without further manufacturing or processing is the foreign supplier. The importer for foreign supplier verification purposes is an important term for you to understand. This is very different from the importer of record. As product crosses the border into the U.S., Customs and Border Protection handles that process, and they identify at the time that the product crosses the border who the importer of record is for customs purposes. There is now a new identifier within the Customs and Border Protection system called an importer for FSVP purposes, and that is the U.S. owner or consignee of an article of food that's being offered for import into the United States. So if a broker is arranging for product to cross from Canada to the US, and they are the importer of record potentially, their identifier would be on that Customs and Border Patrol system record. But if you, as the delivery point in the US, the consignee that has agreed to purchase this food and this container of product is coming to your facility, you would be identified as the importer for FSVP purposes. If there is no US owner or consignee for an article of food, then there needs to be some agreement between the importer of record and some other party to play that role. So a qualified individual, we discussed this term and definition for the Food Safety Modernization Act. For FSVP purposes, this person needs to have some additional qualifications in terms of they must be able to understand the language of any records that they would need to perform. So if the food safety records were in another language, they would have to be then qualified to read and understand that language. So what foods are covered by the Foreign Supplier Verification Program? All human and animal food offered for import into the United States that's intended for consumption unless it is specifically exempted. And similar to the Food Safety Modernization Act, the other parts of that act, exempt products are those imported for research and evaluation, personal consumption, transshipments through the U.S., or products produced in the U.S. and then exported and returned. I'm not really sure what an example of that would be, but so these next few slides are really directed towards human food, so I'm not going to address these. I will pause on them very casually here in case you have a question on them or want to read them as you review this video. So what if the U.S. importer is a processor who imports ingredients? And this is the situation that a livestock feed mill in the U.S. will find themselves in. And basically, the preventive controls rule that you're required to comply with under the animal food rule contains supply chain provisions similar to the Foreign Supplier Verification Rule. So if you are complying, you've written your food safety plan, you've analyzed all of the hazards associated with the foods that the raw materials and ingredients that you use in your manufacturing, you are deemed to be in compliance with most of the foreign supplier verification requirements for the food being imported. The only time that you may need to implement additional requirements of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program would be if you recognized a raw material or ingredient as requiring a preventive control, and that preventive control is a supply chain applied control. And it's been determined that that would be a very rare occurrence, especially in animal food. So the only additional requirement that you would have in order to meet this rule would be to identify yourself as the FSVP importer in the Customs and Border Patrol system, and that is done by supplying your DUNS number to Customs and Border Protection for entry into that system. So with that being said, we'll continue to talk about the FSVP requirements, and I think you will see that this aligns itself with the supply chain applied control within the animal food rule. So for foods that you are importing under the FSVP requirements, you would need to conduct a hazard analysis to identify known and reasonably foreseeable hazards that are both biological, chemical, and physical, evaluate and approve each foreign supplier, determine what foreign supplier verification activities are necessary and appropriate, as well as their frequency, take corrective actions based on those verification activities, and reevaluate the FSVP whenever you become aware of a food safety issue, or at least every 3 years. Identify the FSVP importer at entry and document all of the above. So I think as we read through those, we see that pretty much follows the supply chain applied control process that we talked about in the Animal Food Rule. So FSVP importers must identify and evaluate known or reasonably foreseeable hazards. You're doing that as part of your hazard analysis and your food safety plan. If you are a manufacturer, if you are not a manufacturer, but you are the importer of foods, even though you are otherwise not subject to the preventive control sections of the rule, the foreign supplier rule would then kick in, and you would have to establish a hazard analysis for those imported foods. And of course, the hazard analysis must be documented. FSVP importers must evaluate each foreign supplier's performance, processes and procedures for ensuring food safety, and the history of compliance. FSVP importers must approve each foreign supplier and have written procedures to ensure that they only use that approved foreign supplier. Before importing FSVP, importers must select and conduct one or more appropriate verification activities for that foreign manufacturer, and those verification activities are required for all hazards requiring a control. The FSVP importer must determine not only the appropriate verification activities, but also the frequency with which you will look at those and perform those verifications. So some examples of the verification activities would be audits. Audits are required for any product that you're importing that represents a SACOTA hazard, serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals. But another verification activity could be chosen in the absence of a SACOTA hazard. Those types of verification activities include sampling and testing, reviewing the supplier's records, and other appropriate verification activities. So the FSVP importer must ensure that those activities are performed properly. If you determine that the foreign supplier is not producing food in a manner that provides at least the same level of public health protection as U.S. safety standards, the importer must document and correct any deficiencies. Of course, corrective actions may include using a different foreign supplier and eliminating that supplier for that product. FSVP importers must regularly reevaluate their hazard analysis and the foreign supplier performance at least every 3 years. So this is similar to the reanalysis of your food safety plan. You would have to perform a reanalysis of your FSVP importer's food safety system at least every 3 years, or when you are aware of a change or you have a situation where there is a food safety risk and for cause you would need to reevaluate their system. Creating and maintaining records. All documentation that's required by the FSVP rule must be complete and kept for 2 years and must be made available to the FDA upon request. Same general rules as the other rules within the Food Safety Modernization Act. The FDA holds the Foreign Supplier Verification Program importer accountable for all of the requirements. However, you may rely on third parties to assist you with the process, so long as each of the functions within the rules requirements are performed by a qualified individual, and you as the importer must review the results of all of those activities. You cannot, however, rely on the foreign supplier to conduct their own audit of their food safety system and use that. This is where the third-party certification rule comes in, and the foreign supplier verification program will really drive third-party systems that are used to certify foreign manufacturers for products imported into the United States, in order for you to be able to rely on those audit systems. Okay, there are some modified requirements for very small importers and certain small foreign suppliers. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think it probably has very minimal applicability in a livestock feed mill, as does the Foreign Supplier Verification Program as a whole. So I'll pause here for a moment so that you could read this if you are interested. And of course, these areas are probably, while they're not solely related to human food, they're more applicable to human food. So I'm also not going to spend a lot of time talking about exemptions and qualified facilities. So what would appropriate corrective actions be? It depends really on the circumstance. You could discontinue using that foreign supplier or find another suitable alternative for that product that you're importing, but you must document any corrective actions that you take once you're aware of a food safety issue and a corrective action with a foreign supplier. This section is interesting. If a foreign supplier is under the regulatory oversight of their government, and that their government's food safety system is recognized by the FDA as comparable to the US, then there are modified requirements for the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. As of this recording in May of 2018, Canada's food safety system is recognized, and I believe that a vast majority in the region that may be listening to this recording would be importing grains from Canada. So that is a recognized system, and also New Zealand is recognized, and I know there are several other countries that are in the process of being recognized, but that is something that you may want to consider in your review of the requirements of this rule. So when you identify that you're importing from from a country with an approved system, before importing that food, you must determine and document that your foreign supplier is under the oversight of that regulatory authority, and that they have no issues with that authority, that they're in good standing, and that information may be relied upon. If any information indicates food safety hazards that are not being significantly minimized or prevented, you must take prompt corrective action. You may need to provide additional documentation, as a foreign manufacturer may need to provide the foreign importer with the FSVP importer with additional information and documentation relative to their food safety systems in order to import food into the United States. everyone within the supply chain, the foreign supplier, the vendors along the supply chain route should begin conversations, should have begun conversations well over a year ago about how to comply with this rule and to make sure that all of the parties involved understand what their role is in the food safety system for importing food into the United States. So here is a summary of the preventive controls rule for foreign supplier verification. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can attempt to either answer your questions or refer you to someone who can. I do know that Cornell University has training programs that go into more detail in the foreign supplier verification program, so that is a resource that you could use. And I will be posting with this video a copy of the manual that FSPCA provides to go along with this module. Feel free to download that, read through that, and determine what actions you may need to take. Thank you for participating, and if you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to me.